Friends, it's a real privilege to be sharing with you today. Thank you, Mike. One of the things that often happens in the gatherings of our family or extended family is the telling or the retelling of stories. Grandchildren often ask me, tell me about a story about my mum or dad. Fun activity over morning tea on a Thursday with some of our grandchildren is to choose 3 or 4 stories. Stories that they don't want to know I've chosen until we actually get to sharing the story. But the stories are becoming so familiar that children and Julia sometimes finish lines and even retell aspects of the story in their own words. Could be Jonah and the big fish, or Elijah and the ravens, or Daniel and the lions, or it could be the cat in the hat, or the fish, Otto, that wouldn't stop growing, or Duke, the diggingest dog, who dug up grass and dug up weeds and dug up daisies and dug up seeds and dug up the fence and dug up the gates. He dug up the garden of Mrs. Thwaites. You know those stories, don't you? And sometimes as the story unfolds, there's a question about why or how did that happen? Or why did he or she say that or do that? The book of Ruth in the Old Testament that we've been exploring over the past 3 weeks in our series called Faithful is a favourite story for me and maybe for many of us. There's hope and tragedy, reality and mystery, new starts and romance, care and tension, faithfulness and responsibility in life and in business. Sometimes we get so engrossed in the story, it's hard to see anything else or to step back and see what's happening in the big picture or the big story of life. For a few moments today, let's recap and remind ourselves of the story so far and 3 of the 4 main characters, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. The story is about a family in the time of the judges of Israel, a time before Israel had a king and the nation was ruled by judges. It was a dark time, and many families experienced some real challenge and lots of misery and emptiness. And in the family highlighted in the book of Ruth, the mum and the dad and 2 sons leave Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, because of famine, and they go around the Dead Sea to the other side, to the land of Moab. And sometime later, the sons marry Moabite women, and then tragedy strikes. All 3 males, a husband and 2 sons, end up dying in Moab, leaving the wife and the mum. Naomi, without a male relative to care for and provide for her in a foreign land, it's a difficult situation. Did you know that the Dead Sea is so full of various salts that you cannot sink? I've tried it. A person becomes unsinkable in the Dead Sea. A bit like Naomi. She was a woman of character, a faithful woman. What was her secret? Well, that's the introduction, and the story continues in 4 acts. Act 1, after the death of her husband and 2 sons, Naomi, with one of her daughters-in-law, returns to Bethlehem. And note in the text that it's just as the barley harvest starts. She left in famine. She comes back at the start of the barley harvest. There would have been celebration and rejoicing. Was it a sign of something new? One of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, came with her, declaring to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." What had Ruth seen in Naomi, her mother-in-law, that so convinced her that she needed to leave familiar surrounds and family and explore life in Bethlehem? Act 2. Ruth meets Boaz. a mature man, a man of character, well respected in the community. He looks out for and he provides for Naomi and for Ruth. You see, word had gotten around about how Ruth had cared for and looked out for Naomi in her grief and loss. And Boaz, as a relative, wanted to bless them both. Act 3. A story filled with romance and respect. Ruth is portrayed in Act 3 as a woman of character. But if you want a romantic story, check the threshing floor story and Ruth lying at the feet of Boaz. All of it in a culturally appropriate way. Act 4. Boaz arranges to marry Ruth, and his loyalty to God and God's purposes and his loyalty to his family are highlighted. A son is born to Ruth and Boaz, and Naomi gets to be Nana and loves it. There's joy and fullness in her life again. You know, at the end of the book of Ruth, 4 chapters, very short book, at the end of the book of Ruth, there is a little epilogue in the form of a genealogy. It outlines that Ruth and Boaz's baby, called Obed, is later to become the grandfather of King David. Coincidentally, from whose line Jesus is born centuries later. Was it coincidental? Or perhaps God incidental? That's the story of Ruth. Or is there more? Have you ever thought about what our lives and choices might look like from the outside in? The reality is that most of the time we have no idea what role we play in the bigger picture, and most of the time it's only in retrospect that we can make sense of what was happening. But wait, there is someone who does have an idea of the role we play. It's the 4th main character in the book of Ruth, a character barely seen in the story, but very involved. Hardly mentioned, but working in and through the lives of ordinary people. There is more in this story than meets the eye. The 4th character is God, but there is no record of God directly speaking. There are no miracles or dreams or visions or commands. There are no prayers specifically in the book. And whenever God is mentioned, he's always referred to by his covenant name, Yahweh or the Lord. In other words, the one who is faithful to his promises, the one who blesses by giving good crops again, the one who is trustworthy and faithful in every season. What do we see from God's perspective in this story? Where and how does God reveal himself? Friends, this is not just a love story. It's not just in the Bible to show that mothers-in-law are great people. And I hasten to add, because I've got 2 of them, that they are great people. It's a story about God and how he restores and resources those who put their hope in him. It's about God's faithfulness even in the midst of challenging circumstances, and how God works to bring good out of tough times. He's got great form in that. It's about God working in the ordinary, the mundane, everyday events of the lives of people to develop their character, to bless others, to be resilient in the face of challenge and loss. In this story, Ruth, she's an outsider, a Moabite, someone that Israelites didn't have a great relationship with. But Ruth sees firsthand the way God sustains Naomi in her loss. And so Ruth somehow opens up her life for God to work, such that she's willing to break social conventions of her people to support and do what is right by her mother-in-law. God honours Ruth's integrity, her hard work, her respect for her new people, and weaves her into his big story of redemption. Boaz is a man of character, well respected in the community, responsible and honest in his dealings. And we read that he readily blesses his workers. He welcomes strangers. He redeems Naomi's endangered family line because he's a kinsman redeemer, a kinsman guardian who helps those relatives that are in difficult circumstances. Naturally, in his conversation with both his workers and with Ruth, he acknowledges the provision of God. His life is shaped and resourced by God. He, with Ruth, becomes the ancestor of the Messiah, Jesus. Naomi, the third character in the story, loses her entire family in this story. And although the tragedy may suggest that God had abandoned her, and although there might always be unanswered and unresolved questions, God steers Naomi in a way that sees amazing restoration for her and a great experience of renewed life. Her dark night becomes part of the story of God bringing David to be king, and centuries later, as a descendant of Naomi, we find Jesus being born, the guardian redeemer for all humanity. This little, seemingly insignificant story about redemption for two bereaved women is plugged into the greatest global story of redemption in a time when there were lots of irresponsibility in the lives of those who were supposed to be the people of God. The book of Ruth called the people back to greater responsibility and faithfulness before God, who is always faithful in every season of life. It's the story of people faithful to God being counted as part of God's plan through Jesus to redeem the world. Are the coincidences in this story really coincidences? Or could they be God incidences? Ruth invites us to consider how God wants to be and is more and more involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives, including times of bereavement, times of needing to move, times when there are lack of resources, times when family responsibilities crowd in on top of us. God looks to work through all people regardless of their age, sex, race or nationality. The story of Ruth is a beautiful example of God's impartiality. You know, the story of Ruth reminds us that God is always looking for those whose hearts are totally his, in order that he might show himself strong on their behalf and work in and through them and their daily responsibilities to be the means of helping others experience life and growth, and in so doing partner with Jesus in his mission. Friends, what on earth are we here for? Well, Ruth's great, many times great-grandson, Jesus, our Redeemer, phrased it this way. We read in Matthew 5, "Let me tell you why you're here. You're here to be salt seasoning that brings out the God flavours of this earth." Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colours in the world. God's not a secret to be kept. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. You know, a few years later, the Apostle Paul wrote to some followers of Jesus in Corinth. "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, his representatives, as though God were making his appeal through us." Friends, like Naomi, your life could be used to prompt and arouse the curiosity of someone like Ruth, to explore what it means to know God and to be connected with his family. Like Ruth, today you may not know anything about God, or even if there is a God, but you've met somebody who does. And like Ruth, you could be sensing the prompting of the God you've heard about or just getting to know, to leave the security of what you've always known, to step into a whole new adventure of living, the end of which you may not live to see, but it will be eternally significant. Or friends like Boaz, the role you play in your network or community or business or place of employment or neighbourhood or sporting or leisure club or Probus group. Like Boaz, you could be a model as you generously provide for others, and especially for those who are marginalised or vulnerable for whatever reason. And as you do it, naturally acknowledge your dependence on and relationship with Jesus. You know, the Apostle Paul, writing to the followers of Jesus in Colossae, expressed what Boaz and Ruth and Naomi all modelled. He says, "Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders," that is, people who don't yet know Jesus. "Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation, your life, be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." As has often been said, the choices we make today determine the stories we tell or are told about us tomorrow. Friends, the end of your story and mine is not yet written. And the God who created us wants to include us in the adventure of his big story. Will you and will I let him? In the way we work and speak, in the way we relate and respond, in the way that we engage and care, in the way that we're transparent and honest, in the way we acknowledge needs and extend grace, in the way we mess up, say sorry, make amends and learn through it. Who knows the ripple effect of a choice that you make today, or of a kind word spoken today, or of an investment in another, or of a gift that offers hope, or of a life that arouses curiosity about God, or of an introduction to Jesus? You know, one of the great privileges of my life is to engage with people in times of celebration like weddings, one of which I was privileged to share in yesterday, and to hear in the preparation for that, in the conversation around that, of the way that significant people shared a word of encouragement or introduced someone to Jesus and changed their life forever. But it's also a great privilege for me to be involved in times of grief and loss, and when lives are celebrated in funeral services. And just a week or two ago, I was privileged to lead the service for a lady called Phil, a 94-year-old, in many ways an unremarkable life. She was an auntie to me by marriage. But you know what? Despite the unremarkability of her life, there was incredible faithfulness in her life. She worked in the same company for 51 years. She invested in co-workers and colleagues such that at her retirement, the manager expressed that if everyone had lived and worked like Phil, Australia would be a better place. And you know, one of the things that has happened during COVID is that when you only have 10 who can go to a service, you invite people whose lives have been impacted by the one who's passed to send things that you can share at the service. And you know, at Phil's service a couple of weeks ago, people who are now in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s shared stories of the way that the action and the words and the hospitality and the care of Phil had impacted them eternally. They'd trusted their life to Jesus because of the way that she'd lived and worked and shared. You know, in the book of Ruth, in the middle of ordinary, mundane, difficult, challenging aspects of life, we see faithful women and men through whom the covenant faithful God works to bring about his purposes. Do you want that to be true of you? You know, our ordinary, is a great opportunity for the extraordinary of God to be experienced in our life and through our life as a channel for others to be blessed. You know, the verse that Tim used at the start of our service today is another verse from Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he says to them, he's reflecting on his own life, and he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live. In other words, my ego, my self-life has been submitted to all that Jesus wants to do. I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me. He's our kinsman redeemer, like Boaz was, who loved me and gave himself for me. Friends, if you want that to be true for you, you could pray a simple prayer like, faithful, loving, gracious God, thank you for the way you work your purposes out in and through ordinary people like us. I want that to be true of my life. Thank you for Jesus who came to be our Redeemer. I open my life to receive your grace, your forgiveness, and your power. Please work in and through me. Why not make this your prayer today? I'd love to lead us in that prayer, and I invite you, if it's helpful, to bow your head and let's pray. Faithful, loving, gracious God, thank you for the way that you work your purposes out in and through ordinary people like us. I want that to be true of my life. Thank you for Jesus who came to be our Redeemer. I open my life to receive your grace, forgiveness, and power. Please work in and through me. Amen.